For the longest time, I've been looking for really solid educational podcasts. And in the past years, I've found some that were pretty interesting, but really horrible audio quality, or looking at content that I was teaching, but it was such a dry and kind of dull presentation of the content. But in 2018, I started to find some really good podcasts and some that had just started in 2018 that I wanted to share with you. These are 6 podcasts that every educator should be listening to. Now, I would probably put a little asterisk next to every educator because I'm going to go through the list in order from the broadest, from just general education podcasts, down to the podcast with very narrow focuses. One of the first ones that I found just a month ago is the Wired Educator. Kelly Croy is the host of it, and he's also the director of innovation out in Ohio, has 26 years of classroom experience. And what stuck out to me from this podcast was not only the production value was really high quality, it sounded like they were using high quality microphones and the audio was processed and it sounded really crisp, but Kelly does a really good job of interviewing the guests. He's very comfortable and keeps the conversation going and asks questions that I would want to ask myself. He interviews all different types of people from education to talk about things within the classroom, but also things outside of the classroom in the life of a teacher. And last year I had a couple episodes on how to manage your finances on a teacher budget, as well as how educators can become published. And so he covers a wide range of topics that I think would be applicable to most educators. The second educational podcast that you should be looking at this year is Brainwaves with a V. The brain part comes from the name of the school district that they're a part of. But Ben Kolb and Becky Peters are the hosts of this one, and I think the biggest strength of this one is some of the guests that they've had on the show. They interview some big names in education. One of the ones that I enjoyed listening to was Dan Meyer, who's just like the guy in math education. They also interviewed Dan Pink, who's a New York Times bestseller. He's got one of the top viewed TED Talks on motivation, as well as Dan Heath, who's also another New York Times bestseller. And a lot of these people are kind of in the self-improvement business space, but the interviews on Brainwaves talks about how they take those elements and those ideas and implement them into the classroom. I also really appreciate the show notes. They're some of the most comprehensive show notes that I've seen for any podcast, with links and basically anything that they talked about in the episode. So I can see at a glance, is this going to be an episode that really kind of resonates with me and something that I'm looking for? The third podcast every educator should be listening to is The Cult of Pedagogy. Jennifer Gonzalez is the host of this one, and it leans a little bit more towards the language arts content, but there's a lot of episodes that's applicable to any content area. And Jennifer does a really good job of looking at technology in the classroom, as well as a lot of hot button issues in education, like creating equity in your classroom, restorative justice, innovation in the classroom, creating a safe space for your LGBTQ students, and a lot of other stuff. She does a mix of solo and interview podcasts. The solo podcasts have really good content, but I prefer the conversational nature of the interviews. It's less like she's reading something and more just interacting and asking questions and going back and forth with the guests. The fourth podcast every educator should be listening to in 2019 is the Start Ed Up podcast with an educator named Don Wettrick, and it's all about innovation and entrepreneurship, hence the name. Take the idea of a startup in entrepreneurship world, so Start Ed Up, Start It Up. I didn't get that till like the 5th episode in. The strength of this podcast is a lot of the guests that Don is able to get in the podcast. A lot of people in the business space, from Gary Vaynerchuk to Seth Godin to Dan Pink, and he's even had opportunities to have Tim Ferriss talk to his class. He's had opportunities to have the #1 video game live streamer on the internet named Ninja actually call his class. So it's super cool what he's doing. He has some episodes where he's actually doing reflections with students from his entrepreneurship and innovation class, as well as a super short 5-minute solo episode every Monday. And in 2019, he is doing something called Crucial Conversations on Fridays, where he and another educator from a different school in a different state and a different demographic talk education and go back and forth and share their different perspectives on what they're seeing and what's working and what's not. It's a great podcast. The 5th educational podcast that you should be listening to in 2019 is the Making Math Moments That Matter podcast. This one is specific to mathematics, but it's 2 math teachers, Kyle Pierce and John Orr, that in addition to being math educators and doing the podcast, they also lead workshops for math educators and how to create a more meaningful math experience for their students. I love this one because also the quality is really good. They're using good microphones, everything's really clear, everything's loud enough, which is a big deal. I hate when I have to crank up my car radio just to hear the interview. But they also use research-based ideas and principles from the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics, particularly one book that shaped my math education called 5 Practices for Orchestrating Productive Mathematical Discussions. They have some episodes where it's just the 2 of them, some interviews, and what I think is really unique about their podcast is that they have these mentoring session episodes where they will be on the phone with a math teacher and it turns into a mentor teaching session where that math teacher will share some of his or her struggles in the math classroom, and Kyle and John will actually walk through them, and you get to sit in and listen on that mentor teaching session. Really cool and really unique, and I think can bring a lot of value to every math teacher from kindergarten all the way to advanced mathematics in high school. And the sixth podcast that every teacher should be listening to is the Academy of eSports. I did not think that there would be a podcast that was solely devoted to education and eSports. And if you don't know what eSports is, it's the billion-dollar industry of competitive video games. I found this podcast when I was looking for resources because I'm starting to do an eSports type project at my school. And then I saw James O'Hagan's name pop up and the Academy of eSports. And I was like, what? There's actually a podcast for this? But if you're curious about the whole eSports industry and how universities are now offering scholarships for their own eSports teams, and that there's actual universities that have their own eSports bachelor's programs, James O'Hagan explores all of these ideas, what to do, how to get started, what do you do if you're an eSports coach, and exploring all the different avenues where eSports and education combine. And so those are 6 educational podcasts that I think every teacher should be listening to in 2019. I found most of these people because I started my own podcast this past year as well. Tom, was this a ploy just to talk about your own podcast? A little bit. But the Thom Gibson Podcast is an NPR style podcast where I'm doing stories from the classroom, where I get classroom audio and I get audio with interviews with those teachers in those classrooms, and we reflect on what they did and what went well and how other teachers can replicate some of those ideas in their own classrooms. So that is all I'll say about my podcast. All of the podcasts I mentioned are linked in the description down below. Are there any educational podcasts that you listen to that you think other educators could be benefiting from this year in 2019? If so, leave a comment with a link to your favorite episode of that podcast. My name's Thom Gibson. If you'd like to stay in the loop with any upcoming videos, which are generally about education, I also include episodes of my podcast here on the YouTube channel. Feel free to subscribe. If you like this video and you think others could benefit from it, hit the like button. It'll help it show up a little bit more in the search results when people are looking for educational podcasts. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you learned something today, and hopefully I will see you in the next video.